thank you for the invitation to be part of this event, which is just fantastic and well done. And so thank you, David, for organizing it. And
Here.
thank you all of you for.
Yes.
So I have a handout. I'll just send it each way, and this will help us move along. And so I thought I might just begin briefly with a follow-up from the bus ride yesterday, and just clarify one further thing that we kind of left hanging, and then move into this discussion. And this will be focused on one particular aspect, fairly contained aspect of the 4th century debates over Nicene, pro-Nicene theology. This is one that gets overlooked a fair bit, both in the historiography, at least until recent times, and certainly in the Wesleyan reception of this, it's very much overlooked. So I thought it might be interesting and perhaps helpful for us to see this. As we move through this, I'm going to move through the historical stuff fairly, try to keep a good pace. If you have questions about the historiography, if you have questions of this historical nature, feel free to just put your hand up. I'll stop and we'll address those at any point. If your idea is to have a discussion of the theological issues, I love that. But let's try to get through at least the historical overview before we turn our attention to the theological discussions. So if I sense this going that way, I may just ask us to hold that. All right. So briefly, as follow-up from yesterday, before we get to the main point, we were talking about the different different groups in the mid-4th century that emerged. Not just simply an issue of the Arians versus the Orthodox. It's more the pro-Nicene camp in various iterations and with different, in some cases, different sorts of arguments. And then there are other views on the market. All the plethora of creeds produced from this part of the world in those decades. Some of which were overtly homoian, which just wanted to say like the Son is like the Father, or like the Father according to the Scriptures. And then mid-century, we get the rise of what is sometimes known as the Homoousion party, Basil of Ankara and others. And then we also get to what is in the older literature was known as the Neo-Arian position. Representative main exponent would have been someone like Eunomius. And this is sometimes also called the Heterousion view, is a way of shorthand. Well, we talked just briefly on the bus about that, and what we didn't get to were sort of the pro-Nicene arguments. We didn't really talk about those. And so I thought just really briefly, let me just, embarrassingly briefly, let me just run through 4 of these. One of them, well, I saw it's one argument, it's a whole battery of exegetical arguments. And I mentioned yesterday the twin tools of prosopological exegesis and partitive exegesis. And partitive exegesis being really crucial here as a hermeneutical tool, or a hermeneutical key to sort of unlock these debates. Because on the one hand, you have the non-Nicene views who are really adamant to point to, really exercise to point to biblical passages that speak to the weakness of Christ, the fear of Christ, the ignorance of Christ, the submission of Christ. And the Arians, of course, are quick, and others are quick to point to those. Meanwhile, the pro-Nicenes are really quick to point to a whole other set of passages. So both are appealing to sets of passages. What do? Well, if it turns out if one can handle both sets of text, and the other can only handle one set of text, then you know one side's got the upper hand. And the partitive exegesis tool allowed the pro-Nicenes to have the upper hand, because they could say these refer to the one person of the Son according to the divinity, and these refer to the person according to the human nature assumed, or the form of a servant assumed, as sometimes it's put. So it's not just humanity, it's even the mission assumed in the taking on of humanity. So those sort of exegetical arguments are a big part of this, massive part of this. But they're not the only ones. There's also quite simply what is sometimes referred to as the doxological argument. And it's really simple and straightforward. We can state it a bit formally, just for summary. Premise 1, only God is rightly worshipped. Premise 2, Jesus Christ is rightly worshipped. Conclusion 3, therefore, Jesus Christ is God. And this isn't, of course, they can appeal to scriptures showing that Jesus is worshipped, but it's also the common practice of Christians. It doesn't matter if you speak Syriac or Latin or Greek. It doesn't matter where you are, what you speak, or how, who your friends are. You know that when we gather together on the Lord's Day, we worship Christ. The second one is like to it, but I think even has more weight in the debates, and that is what is sometimes called the soteriological argument, and it runs similarly. 1, only God saves. And of all the difficult debates in theology, that shouldn't be one of them. 2, Jesus Christ is the Savior. And again, this is obviously grounded in the Holy Scripture, but it's also the common practice of Christians all over. People, illiterate Christians, sometimes would memorize the Jesus Christ, God, Son, Savior, right? There's hardly anything more basic Christian identity than that we trust Christ for our salvation. Well, modus ponens, if you want to run it this way, then conclusion 3, therefore Jesus Christ is God. So you've got the exegetical arguments, the doxological argument, the soteriological argument. Those, of course, are our names for them, not theirs, but these are all, I think, really important in these debates. And then, frankly, there's just the monotheism argument. So if you take, for instance, the one of the Arian or Arian-type views, where you have the high God, who is strictly speaking unknowable, and then you have this created intermediary, who is both the highest, simultaneously the highest creature, but also a lesser divinity. How many gods do you have?
2.
Well, you have at least 2. Depending on what you do with the Holy Spirit, you may have a third. And for any monotheist, that's at least 1 God too many. I actually think that these are some of the arguments that do carry weight in this. So that's super quick. I just thought we didn't mention that yesterday. I know, you all know that, but maybe a brief review would be helpful as we're moving forward. All right, so now into today. The doctrine of divine simplicity has been widely neglected in quite a bit of modern contemporary theology, period, but especially in Wesleyan theology. So even think of like standardish textbooks or commonly used textbooks in historical theology. Think, for instance, of Justo Gonzalez. One can read through his church history, but also through his historical theology, and find hardly a reference, in fact, hardly an allusion to the doctrine of simplicity. Thomas Oden, whose whole sort of claim to theological fame is recovery of this tradition, in the big 3-volume set has 1 small paragraph on the doctrine of divine simplicity. It just doesn't show up. And it's largely been lost or almost sort of washed out of our heritage in many ways. There's a lot of reasons for that. We can talk about that later if we have time. I'm just pointing out, in the year of our Lord 2025, that's the way it is. Sometimes when this does get mentioned, it's sort of, the doctrine of simplicity is thought of as a sort of distinctly high medieval philosophical innovation that kind of came in and was sometimes people look at as just nothing more than the corruption of Christian theology by Aristotelian philosophy, or it'll push it back at least to Platonism. That's it. That's often the way it's described when it does come up, and sometimes that's the way it's dismissed.
Yeah.
But the basic meaning of the doctrine, and this is just basic as we can go, is that there are no parts or pieces of God. God is not composed of any elements or anything more fundamental than God. And so we'll talk sometimes theologians will talk about divine attributes, and when we do that, we are attributing certain things of God as true, or predicating certain things of God as true. But it's sometimes, one could be misled by this into thinking God is sort of to put it super crudely, like so crude no one ever put it this way, but well, I'm a Wesleyan, so my theology is God's 30% power, but 68% love and 2%, right? And then you're Reformed, so you think God's like 98% power, right? Nobody will say it that crudely, but it's easy to think in terms of the divine attributes as sort of these collections of things that God is built up out of. As if God sort of taps into something outside of God and draws from that and just gets more of that than anyone else. Right? That is what the doctrine of divine simplicity is at pains to deny, is that God is not made up or composed. In this case, by the way, God is utterly unlike creatures. And that's also one of the main motivations of the doctrine. Everyone and everything you can think of other than God is arguably, at least, going to be composed of things more fundamental than itself. There are some versions of views of the human soul that might be an exception. Some people think the human soul is simple. Some people think it's complex. Some people think we don't have a soul. We'll set that aside for now. But think about everything in this room. The things you're sitting on, the things that are holding, the things you're in front of you. Everything in here is composed of things more fundamental, right? We are in our common experience of things, we're built up out of things more fundamental, and then we thus, of course, in many ways depend upon those things. The doctrine of divine simplicity is meant to deny all of these aspects. And so the doctrine of simplicity just says there are no parts of pieces of God. God is not composed of anything more fundamental than God. God doesn't rely upon anyone or anything else. God has no metaphysical complexity, and this is super, super important. God has no moral complexity whatsoever. So this is all over patristic literature, all over medieval theology, that when we talk about God being good, we're not just predicating like a quality of God, that like, well, I'm pretty good, Michael Jordan was pretty good, a little better than me, right? We're not just predicating and then, oh, God's really good, right? Like God just has a bigger dose of that than the rest of us. All over this literature, you'll find statements like this, that God is good, is goodness itself, or is goodness himself. So these are all fundamental statements of the doctrine of divine simplicity, and they're not, sometimes contrary to popular opinion, and this is not just the invention of sort of late medieval or high medieval philosophical thinking. As Richard Muller puts it, the doctrine of divine simplicity is among the normative assumptions of theology from the time of the Church Fathers to the age, yes, of the great medieval scholastic systems, to the era of the Reformation and post-Reformation theology, and indeed on into the succeeding era of late orthodoxy and rationalism. And this is actually true. Even, for instance, René Descartes has a strong doctrine of simplicity. The fate of this in modern theology is another thing. But for our purposes, we can just say this is part of the theological heritage of the church. It is part of the heritage of the church here in the 4th century. And there is background to this, obviously, some of the Neoplatonic background, and Plotinus and others, Plotinus mainly, is promoting this from a non-Christian perspective, but among early Christians who were overtly defending, in some cases they don't need to defend. They assume and then argue from a doctrine of simplicity. You can find people like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Origen, Clement of Alexandria, and others. I can point to literature if you're interested in looking at that further. For our purposes, it's important to see that it's held by people like Athanasius and the so-called Cappadocian theologians. And for our purposes, we'll focus on Gregory of Nyssa. Here's just a couple of representative quotes. Gregory says that the divine nature does not possess the good by acquisition, or participate only in the goodness of some good which lies above it. This is, as I said a moment ago, the overt, right? This is the explicit denial that there is anything called goodness outside of God, that God just gets a bigger chunk of than we do. this is a fundamental statement of the teaching. The divine nature is simple. Obviously in Greek, or sorry, in Latin, you're going to get simplicitas, but in Greek, all over is haplē. Another statement where a compound is assumed, there the dissolution of that compound must be admitted. This previews what are going to show up in some of the medieval arguments, and I think it's a mistake to sort of download everything Aquinas, for instance, thought about simplicity to Gregory. I think that's a mistake. I think there are different things going on. But you can see here, in some cases, there's a lot of overlap, and this is a preview of the coming overlap of this. This is one of the scholastic arguments for the doctrine of simplicity, is that where a compound is there, something put the compound together, and the compound is subject to dissolution. In fact, in our common experience, it happens to everything. I mean, we visited these older ruins yesterday that have been, amazing as they are, worn down by the weather, right? We, believe it or not, are subject to decomposition. I'm on my second pacemaker. I mean, I'm not barely in my 6th century, and I'm already on my second pacemaker, right? We come apart. 54. 6th century, did I say 6th century? I've been around a while. Listen to me, children. I have authority. Yes.
You see it?
Maybe that was 6th decade. Okay, yeah. We tend to come apart. So he says we must remember that God is not a compound. Whatever God is the whole. And God is by nature simple, or haplē, uncompounded, indivisible. So Gregory has a doctrine of simplicity, and it's all over his writings, and it actually does a lot of work. First time I read through, I remember as a seminary student, first time I read through the Christology of the Later Fathers, the Hardy edition. I didn't have any antenna up, I didn't see it. I remember several years later, I read back through there, I'm like, oh my goodness. And then I'm working through Contra Eunomias, and it's all over the place. This doctrine is all over Gregory's theology. For better or for worse, you can like it or not, I'm just saying it's there. Now, here's what happens in the 4th century, mid-4th century debates, and this is how this doctrine gets weaponized. It gets employed and affirmed by people on various sides, but then also weaponized. So Eunomius, one of the most vocal and probably one of the sharpest opponents of the pro-Nicene account, argues, he makes sort of exegetically grounded scriptural arguments, but he does something that I don't see much in the Homoian side of things, and that is, he's a really sharp thinker who's very quick to reach for philosophical tools in his criticisms of the pro-Nicene views. And this is one of the arguments he makes. So here's the summary of it. First premise: if the doctrine of divine simplicity is true, then there can be no distinction between generate and ingenerate in the divine nature. Well, second premise, we know the doctrine of divine simplicity is true, and you guys agree with me on that, the pro-Nicenes. So, gotcha. 3, therefore, there can be no distinction between generate and ingenerate in the divine nature. And then he's going to move from that to the conclusion that the Son is thus heterousios rather than homoousios. Not homoios, not similar to, not like according to the scriptures, not of similar essence, of other essence, right? And so Eunomius is going to wield the doctrine of divine simplicity to make this argument against the pro-Nicene view. Now, one might think that the thing for a Trinitarian Christological, Christian to do is to step back, right? So if I know a lot of 20th and 21st century theologians whose response to the Eunomian argument would very quickly go something like this. In fact, I've heard some version of this many times. Okay, good job, Eunomius. Good argument. And the way I'm going to avoid the conclusion is just simply to deny the second premise. I'm Trinitarian, I'm Orthodox, therefore, no doctrine of divine simplicity. I don't need it. And if one of them's got to go, clearly simplicity's got to go. And you showed me one of them's got to go. Thank you for clearing that up for us. I didn't like the doctrine anyway. So that's a pretty standard way. That is not the way Gregory goes. Gregory goes a different way. If the doctrine of divine simplicity is true, there can be no gradations of divinity or divisions within the divine nature. That's another way of saying there's no way, there aren't two ways of being God. It's another way of saying if you're God, you're just God. And there aren't rankings or levels. And there, get this, on if one accepts the doctrine of simplicity, it's not so much as logically possible that there are different levels or gradations or rankings of divinity. You either are or you're not. The doctrine of divine simplicity is true. And you know that, Eunomius, because you're arguing from it. 3, therefore, there can be no gradations of divinity or divisions within the divine nature.
So
There's a no missing?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, the handout, yeah, that's, pro tip, proofread your handouts before you take them to a different content.
What should it be?
Yeah,
Can you tell us what it should be?
Number 4.
Number 4, right? There
No.
cannot be.
Yeah, there can be no
No.
gradations.
Okay, no.
Yes, thank you so much. I was wondering, like, why, this isn't that confusing, right? It's, okay. Yeah, good catch. Sorry about that, I apologize. I did catch one other problem with the handout, but I didn't catch that one,
Yeah,
so.
that makes much, there cannot be.
Let me read it out loud then, okay?
Yeah.
4, if the doctrine of divine simplicity is true, there can be no gradations of divinity, no divisions within the divine nature.
So those words are analogous to no distinction.
Actually, that's a great question. I love it, Steve. Because on some versions of the doctrine of divine simplicity, there are meant to be no distinctions whatsoever. On other versions, there can be distinctions, but there can be no divisions or separations.
Okay.
Got it.
I'm not going to promise the doctrine of simplicity is super simple.
Yes.
But I actually, this is a really good point. And it's an important point because there are some, for instance, Jewish and Muslim versions of the doctrine of divine simplicity that insist on denying distinctions.
Right. The question is whether hypostasis is a distinction.
The question is, so that's a great question. And for Gregory, it clearly is. But the way he is using the doctrine of divine simplicity does not demand that. It allows for distinctions, genuine distinctions, and including apparently, let me say this, his account of divine simplicity is used a lot. It's all over the literature, but he doesn't, in any place that I know of, or I think anyone else knows of, develop it formally, like lay it out as such, like the later Latin scholastics will do. So exactly what he means by it, we're sort of piecing it together a bit in ways that we're not when we're reading like Aquinas or Bonaventure or Scotus. They tell us what they're doing really explicitly. We're piecing a bit of this together with him, but it looks like he's allowing distinctions, even distinctions between the divine perfections or divine attributes, but certainly distinctions between the hypostases. And saying, but here's the thing, that doesn't compromise simplicity, because what we're affirming simplicity is of the divine ousia. So we're affirming it of that, and that allows for distinctions in apostasy. So that's him playing defense, Jason. But then moving from defense to offense, he uses the doctrine as a sort of counterattack, because he says, you, Eunomius, want to have this high God and this lesser ranked God who has a whole bunch more power than we do, but not as much as the high God, right? Sorry, dude, pick one.
And I've tried to say in preaching, this means that Jesus is not 1/3 of God.
No,
He's all the God there is.
and so he is the fullness, right? The fullness is in him to to make up it, right?
Oh, I mean, they use that word, right?
Yeah, no, I know, yeah. So does the New Testament, yeah, that's fine, yeah. So what Gregory does is, as you suggest, he uses that distinction to play defense, but then he goes on offense and uses the doctrine of simplicity to push back, because he says for the eunomians, on your account, what you have is you have this high God who's omnipotent, all that, and then you've got this other one who has a lot of divine power, but not all of it, for instance. A lot of divine knowledge, but not all of it. And then Gregory is saying, given simplicity, it can't happen. You can't do that. So either, he's saying to them, either you give up simplicity, and thus, by the way, give up monotheism, or come on over. In other words, you can be a strict monotheist and just be a sort of an adoptionist in Christology. There's one God, and then Jesus is a really good dude who does a lot of good stuff. But you can do that, and you're going to have other problems biblically and theologically if you're trying to be a Christian doing that. But you can do that logically, or you can come over with us. But what you can't do is live in this in-between space of the Arian and Eunomian views. That's the argument. So this does not, Steve, to your question, the bottom of the page here, does not rule out the possibility of genuine distinctions, but does demand that whatever these divine perfections or attributes are, they're mutually entailing, and it certainly eliminates the possibility of any contrast within the divine nature. Now, that's a little bit about how, a really quick shot about how this is used in the 4th century. Since this has come up, if you want to flip over, just say something about, let me just say, we're going to flip the handout. I'll say something real quickly here about, sorry, just once, go to the back page. If you want to do that, I can say something quickly about the subsequent history, and this will be great because we can do a bunch of centuries in just a few minutes, so this is going to be real easy.
Can I ask, just as you go, can you help us understand when we were starting to lose the DDS?
Yeah,
As you
late modern theology, 19th
really?
century,
That
yeah,
recent?
18th and 19th century.
Thank
Yep.
you. Okay.
I mean, it's under pressure earlier, and there are always criticisms against it. And so you see these developments in medieval, a lot of developments in medieval theology, and some of it comes under pressure from medieval Islamic and Jewish theologians. But there are also, I'm going to mention this, just point this out in passing, there are also internal debates within Islamic theology over the doctrine of simplicity. And you get people who are adamantly arguing for it, but then also raising concerns about it, and also disagreeing about the implications of it. And so there's a debate within Muslim theology, medieval Muslim theology, over whether God can know the particulars of human life. So basically a sort of medieval Muslim proposal of something like open theism. Because if God is simple, then God can't know the particulars, like God can't know, because then that would introduce these sort of distinctions within God's knowledge of before and after and contingent necessary and all the stuff that aren't possible. So, but let's set that aside and just keep on the Christian side of stuff here and say that, just point out that there is pressure from Muslim and Jewish theologians on Christian theology. I mean, the constant concern here is that Christians are tritheists who are just confused, right? Christians are people really bad at simple math, and this is an ongoing thing. There are also internal pressures, and these come from disputes, particularly within the Latin tradition. At least those are the ones I know about. For instance, there are other things, but in the Fourth Lateran Council, the a bunch of students of Peter Lombard surprisingly take Peter Lombard's side against Gilbert, and insist that there must be real distinctions between the divine persons. If there aren't real distinctions between the divine persons, then we're not Trinitarians anyway, we're modalist. So there have to be real distinctions between the divine persons. But because of divine simplicity, there can be no real distinction between person and essence. Now the term real distinction here is used as a, the term real distinction is used with technical sense here. It doesn't simply equate to genuine. A real distinction is a distinction between a thing and another thing that's separable from it. And they can be, real distinctions can be between different things of the same kind, or different things of different kinds, or different separable parts of the same thing. So for instance, I've used this before, but there are tables and there are chairs in this room. These are different things of different kinds. There are different chairs. These are different things of the same kind. And these are really distinct. If we took all the chairs but one out of the room, we'd still have one. It wouldn't disappear. If all chairs but one were destroyed, we'd still have one, right? They're logically separable. So we have, these are real distinctions. Think in contrast to real distinctions of conceptual or rational distinctions. These are things that we produce for convenience, and sometimes that really help us out. So think about, to use an old example, morning star, evening star. How many things are up there when we're talking about the morning star and evening star? One, it's the planet Venus, of course, right? But it still is appropriate and actually can be helpful for us. If I'm in Turkey going to bed and, if I'm FaceTiming my family, I don't think it would work out this way, we just assume it would. I say I'm FaceTiming my family and they're like, we miss you, we're on the back deck, it's a gorgeous evening out here, we're watching the sunset, which is always great at our house, and the stars come out, we're seeing the evening star. I'm like, oh, that's so cool. I just stepped down the deck here at the hotel and over the sea, who was talking about this, Charles, this morning, I'm seeing this rosy glow, and guess what's in the sky? I'm seeing the morning star. And we're like, oh, these are two different things. No, these are rational or conceptual distinctions. We're talking about the same thing. But it's actually really meaningful to refer to it as morning star if you're in the morning, and evening star if you're in the evening in a different place. But what the referent of morning star, evening star tells us is more where we are in relation to it than it is talking about two different things. That's a rational or conceptual distinction. Well, if those are the only things you have, then when it comes to Trinity doctrine, you have a problem. At least if you're taking the Latin, the official Latin view. Because in the official Latin view, you must have real distinctions between the persons, but you can't have real distinctions between person and essence. So if your only categories are real distinctions or conceptual distinctions or rational distinctions, right? You have two. Can't be this one, it's got to be this one. Well, if it's only a rational or conceptual distinction, that's not a distinction in God. That's one we're making up and putting onto God, which means we're what? Are we really Trinitarian Christians anymore, or are we, there's an old word for it we use called modalism. And this follows by just straight transitivity of identity. If A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then A is equal to C, and that's not a thing to debate. Once you understand it's true, you see it's necessarily true. And all the medievals, almost all the medievals, are really sure that logic applies to God, and that the law of non-contradiction and principles of identity apply to God. And so the Latin tradition has this issue. It might not be an issue for Gregory, because I don't think Gregory's view is committed to all of this. But it is a problem for subsequent Latin theology, and particularly Roman Catholic, because of course they're committed to Fourth Lateran Council. It's actually a problem for all people in the Latin tradition, but it's especially tight for so you see people like Aquinas, his famous exposition of this doctrine, which I said this before, I'm going to say it again just to make sure we get it. This should not be taken to be the doctrine of simplicity. Aquinas is one version, one very influential version, but one version nonetheless. God is not composed of extended parts, which is to say he does not have a physical body. Like I have extended parts that are extending right now this way and this way. God is not composed of extended parts. God is not composed of form and matter. The form making him the kind of thing he is, the combination of form and matter making God the particular thing that he is. We all are, of course, and everything in this room is composed of form and matter. Combination of form and matter makes this table the table, and this podium the podium. And if it wasn't for the form, we just have wood. If it wasn't for the matter, we just have a blueprint of a podium. We would have it's a combination of form and matter. Put it together, you get this. It's the denial that God is composed of form and matter, a kind of thing he is and the thing he is. No composition of act and potency. On the other hand, God is pure act. No composition of essence and existence. We all are who we are by our stories, in a sense, right? My story makes me who I am. All these contingent experiences I've had have shaped me and formed me as who I am. And it's hard to even tell, it's hard to introduce yourself to someone without telling your story. It's hard to know someone without knowing their story. Because the story of all these contingent experiences make us who we are. Not so with God. God doesn't rely upon a whole set of contingent experiences to grow into something or be something. So this is the denial of act and potency, and this is the denial of essence and existence. Essence and existence, I have a human essence, no surprise. You didn't need to come to Nicaea to learn that. So do you. Hopefully you didn't need to come here to learn that either. But we all have the human essence. But if I were to pass away tonight, the human essence would go marching on, and the rest of you. My existence and my essence are not the same thing. But for God they are. Why? Because God is not part of a class of other deities, of like a group. God's not one of the gods. So there's no thing called godness that goes marching on if God dies. Right? God's essence and existence are the same. God is not composed of subject and accidents, and God is certainly not composed of God plus anything, right? God plus the cosmos. This is Aquinas' famous exposition, which also, by the way, does not give us, my view now, does not give us adequate tools to deal with the conundrum of Trinity and simplicity. Controversial thing to say, but in some circles it is. But that's my view. So we need other options, and so I'm just going to say we need some of these other options, and we get some. Scotus in the Franciscan tradition introduce a further distinction called the formal distinction. These are things that are genuinely distinct but really inseparable, and so this allows the Scotus to avoid the problem. By the way, this is the version of simplicity that gets picked up by people in our, or at least at the headwaters of our own tradition. So Jacob Arminius, for instance, when he affirms simplicity, it's pretty explicit and repeatedly a formal doctrine of simplicity. So it's he's a Scotus, not a Thomist. And so that is part of the sort of in the Wesleyan DNA to take that route. Later Thomism also recognizes that Thomas's account doesn't really work. And so they're making further adjustments and refinements. And then there are Orthodox accounts, and some of which go all the way back to Gregory of Nyssa. And that brings us back full circle here. So there are contemporary debates over this. The doctrine of simplicity is very controversial these days in many circles. Some people say don't like it because of where it comes from, so to speak. Barth and the people of the house and lineage of Barth reject the doctrine because it stems from quote unquote natural theology rather than divine revelation, or a similar kind of concern from very different angles, usually. People who say it has a philosophical rather than biblical basis, and the philosophy bad. This is a lot of evangelicals and open theists. Another was just that it's super counterintuitive. And I think the right thing to say about that is, yes, it is. And that, but honestly, I mean, if God is not a creature or just like a big dude, it's going to be counterintuitive because God is going to be radically surprising in some ways, right? So, I mean, I think it is really counterintuitive. I personally don't see that as an argument. I just think it's a recognition. But some people go on from there and say that this reduces God to being a property rather than a person or three. And this is Al Flanagan's famous argument against it. Others worry that it undercuts, contrary to all intentions, I will say, because it's meant to undergird a robust notion of divine sovereignty, aseity, and freedom. But some people worry that despite all the intentions of the proponents, it actually ends up undercutting that. And again, back to where we began, some people think that the doctrine is inconsistent with the doctrine of the Trinity. And so if you've got to pick, what's a Christian to do? Be a Christian. So much for if the lesson to be learned is that one must either affirm simplicity or Trinitarian orthodoxy, the Christian is going to say so much the worse for simplicity. But for a great deal of Christian tradition, those are not alternatives. In fact, for someone like Gregory of Nyssa, the doctrine of simplicity is a support for the pro-Nicene Trinitarian theology. And for many other theologians in the tradition, it functions exactly that way as well. In other words, it protects us from tritheism, allows us to affirm monotheism with a straight face and a good heart, and is actually a vital part of the Christian theological heritage that should be held on and continued today. I actually just put my cards on the table. Love me or hate me or whatever, but I actually do affirm a doctrine of divine simplicity. Can't go all the way with someone like Aquinas, but I think that there are other resources in the tradition which are super helpful. All right, that was probably too much in too short a time, but
Nice.
that's it. Yeah, fine.
I have two. I'll just one of my two questions.
Yeah, far away.
I don't want you to take on Tom Ward today because I watched you do that at AR, and that was it was a beautiful thing. But since he teaches for my seminary, I'd love for you to say where do you locate the open theists and open relational theists like Tom Ward and others, and even Process, in relation to this, and what do you think their best argument against divine simplicity would be?
So I think that the most, and I don't know that Tom makes this argument, but I think it would be his best bet. Is what's called the modal collapse argument sometimes. This is the modal collapse.
Modal collapse.
And that is this concern that the doctrine of simplicity undercuts genuine agency or freedom, both at the human level and at the divine level. In other words, it reintroduces fatalism. So some people take this denial of act and potency. Now, I'm going back to Aquinas now, because he's the one who gets the most attention. But the denial of act and potency to mean it's not possible for God to do anything other than God does. Well, if that's true, then God can't create a world any different than this one. And if you unpack the notion of world fully enough, right? The world is a possible world then is a complete state of affairs, a full set of everything the way this thing could be or could have gone, right? So a possible world is the story of everything that's ever happened or will happen, right? Well, if there's only one of those available for God, so something about God's nature demands that God can only do one thing, then God can't even do anything other than God does, and you and I can't do anything other than we do. And when you come back things like problem of evil, that just seems utterly hopeless. To me it does, and to a whole lot of folk. So if the doctrine of simplicity entails this modal collapse, this loss of modality or freedom or agency, then that's a huge thing. And that's a huge problem for simplicity doctrine. And that's a concern that should resonate near and dear to Tom's heart. with his concerns about human agency and protecting that. So I actually think that's a worry. And on that issue, I'm actually, again, pretty much where I am with Trinity doctrine. I think that there are some versions of the doctrine of simplicity that actually are going to get us in that problem and not give us the ways out. But there are other versions of the doctrine of simplicity, like the Scotus accounts, for instance, that don't have those entailments and don't get us there. So it's great question. Appreciate it.
Is that his best argument? I mean, why wouldn't he go to synergistic cooperation, where Arminius, this says God can't do it unless God has our participation and cooperation.
Yeah, so, well, that,
And that's part of
Tom's whole God can't stuff,
it's hard to.
the whole, I mean, Tom signs it comes off like he's the first person to recognize this. The whole tradition, every time anybody talks about omnipotence, not the whole tradition, but lots of folk in the tradition, when they talk about omnipotence, they're clearly recognizing. One of the first things is God can't actualize a contradiction. So what? It's not a knock on God's power. It's just saying he, quote unquote, can't do something that's strictly impossible, right? And so there are a lot of these things. And the language of cooperation and synergy is all over the tradition, including even the and I'm not on this team, but even the Reformed scholastics talk about cooperatio, like prevenient grace and cooperative grace is part of the Ordo Salutis for a Reformed scholastic like Amandus Paulinus. It's nothing new. You don't have to be an open theist to affirm cooperation and prevenience. All of that is all in the tradition and it's been there for centuries. Thank you very much. Yeah, sorry, yeah, Esther?
Yeah, I was gonna just say, since a lot of us here are Wesleyan or in the Wesleyan tradition, can you just say a little bit more about that formal distinction from Scotus?
Yeah.
And why that is a refinement of the Thomist
Yeah,
understanding?
he thinks it's a correction, and it's a correction that a lot of the later Thomists are not fond of. They are not very appreciative of his effort to correct Thomas.
So correct on what exactly?
So
Yeah.
all right, that's a great question, thank you. So, recall what I said about real distinctions on the one hand and merely conceptual on the other. If those are your only categories, you're gonna have problems with things like the modal collapse stuff, with things like Trinity doctrine, right? You need other categories, right? And so these later scholastics start offering various options. One of those is the Scotist option, the formal distinction. And so the formal distinction is it's things that are genuinely distinct but not actually separable. So you can't have not separable, so you can't have some but not all. This actually could be viewed as something consistent with Gregory of Nyssa's view, by the way. So so you can have formal distinctions between the divine attributes. So God's justice, for instance, and God's mercy aren't necessarily reducible then to just our way of thinking about it. It can be genuinely distinct in God, but they're not separable. Which, by the way, as Wesleyan, this account, the doctrine of simplicity, grounds an account of divine goodness and grace. So it's not possible, for instance, just to throw some stuff out there, it's not possible that God deals with some people according to this attribute and other people according to this attribute. So these people are predestined this way because of justice, and these people are predestined this way, right? Because these aren't separable things in God. On Doctrine of Atonement, like these kind of overwrought, overdone evangelical penal substitutionary views, where I've heard so many of these sermons, where the gospel is about one part of God at odds with this other part of God. Mm-hmm. And the cross is where God sorts out God's own internal problem. I've heard this stuff explicitly.
Oh my gosh. Like God needs therapy?
But it's like God, because God's love wants to see me saved. God's justice demands to see me damned. How does God sort this out? And then so you get this inter-Trinitarian fight. Jürgen Moltmann calls it that. I mean, it's stasis within God. It's God against God. So it's not just a evangelical, super conservative Baptist. It's also some like people like Moltmann. If you have a doctrine of simplicity, that stuff can't get off the ground. Like it's not even like thinkable. Other than, I mean, you could dream it up, but it's like not seriously. It's not something to seriously be considered. So Scotus will have this formal distinction. Back to your question. And these are things which are genuinely distinct, but not separable. So, divine attributes and divine attributes. Also, divine attributes and divine essence. Also, divine persons. Father is only Father in relation to Son. Son is only Son in relation to Father. They're not even possibly separable or breakable. They are who they are only in their relations to one another, but they are irreducibly distinct. Scotus will also look for other things. He doesn't think there are many examples of this because God's God, right? But he will say, for instance, like, okay, I'll grant you that this next illustration is going to be controversial too, but the human soul has several distinct faculties. For instance, the affections and the will and the reason, right? These are distinct faculties of the human soul, which are not reducible to one another, but aren't separable, right?
Yeah.
You can't have, anyhow, you get the idea. To be really mundane, something like the table in front of us, the flatness, the hardness, and the woodness of the table are genuinely distinct, but they're not truly separable. If you take the flatness off, you don't have a table anymore, sorry, right? Etc. So they're genuinely distinct, but they're not breakable or separable. All right, so this something like the Scotist view is, in my view, going to give us more flexibility theologically and more ability to do these things, and is part of our own sort of Wesleyan heritage, at least upstream in good ways.
Thank you.
Excellent, thank you.